Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Last April the 1st, I put out an announcement that I was running for the mayor of Mississauga. It was April the 1st, and it was an April Fool's joke, though frankly, the response that I've received since then has been kind of interesting and overwhelmingly positive. I thought it would be kind of interesting to explore a couple of topics on this discussion. One of the issues that I talked about in great length was housing affordability. And so, as you know, I've talked to a lot of different people about housing affordability. I've talked about transit and things like this. But one of the other topics that we raised was sort of leadership. And a gentleman that I really respect in politics and in civic life, and frankly, national life, is Dan Donovan. He is the editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine. I've had the privilege of chatting with him a few times before. He's been involved in politics. He's been involved in journalism, being editor and publisher. And he's also been involved in stand-up comedy, so he knows a little bit about having an impact on an audience. And he wrote me that he thought that we need more leaders in municipal politics, and so I thought it would be interesting to just talk sort of not about me or him or anyone, but just generally about the need for leadership in politics, particularly municipal politics, given the comment from last week, but leadership generally, and the style of governance that makes sense. So, Dan Donovan, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you, Brian. It's always a thrill to be on your show, and of course, even off when we're not on the show, and we've had the opportunity to get together at different points over the years. I've always greatly relished our conversations, which at times have they get a little combative at times, but I love it because it's always great to have a substantive discussion. And I think I want to start. We're going to talk about a lot of things, as you just said, but I want to start by congratulating you on entering the arena, as they say, and getting into the race, because it takes, in my opinion, today, anytime someone enters public life, it takes a lot of personal thought and courage to make that. It's gotten so toxic and corrosive in the arena today more than ever. So, a lot of people, you put a lot on the line when you get into politics. And I've often said I was thrilled when I heard you were getting in, because that just came out of nowhere. I'm not sure where I saw it. I was on an announcement on social media or something, and I thought, oh my God, that's fantastic, because I think a lot of really good people have stayed away from politics because of its corrosive nature. And then I think the type of people that we've attracted into politics, as we're seeing across jurisdictions, whether it's federal, provincial, or municipal level, we're not getting the most capable people in. We're certainly not getting the best leaders in. And I think we've certainly dumbed down the process and upped the bureaucracy in government. And now people across the country are suffering because of it. So, and municipal politics, of course, is so important. It's the politics closest to the people, as they say. And it's the politics that makes a real difference in people's lives. So I'm hoping you're going to do it.
Thank you so much, Dan. So, turnout, I guess, would be one indication about whether people think it's important or not. And turnout in municipal politics is abysmal. Why is that?
Well, I think, first of all, I think in Canada, and I think it's the same in a lot of Western democracies, politics and the coverage in a lot of politics that gets to sort of magnified the most is probably the federal level, uh, and then provincially. Locally, it's become much more dissipated, especially in the last decade or so, in terms of the coverage because of the changes in media. But I think people, for local politics, they don't go out and vote as much. They don't actually, the numbers aren't even great at the federal or provincial level. But I'm of the view that there's a way to fix that. We don't ask a lot of our citizens to live in the great democracy that we do live in. And I think a real quick way, to fix it is to do what they do in Australia. You need to go out and vote. And if you don't vote, you're going to get, like a nominal fine. It'll be like a parking ticket or something. But now some people, oh, well, that's the whole point of living in a democracy. We should be allowed to not vote. Absolutely. So you know what? Get off your ass and go out and spoil your ballot. Okay, go to the voting booth and spoil your ballot if you don't want to vote. but I think it's incumbent. We don't ask a lot of people these days, a lot of our citizens, in terms of contributing to their democracy. In some countries, they have conscription. In some countries, they're calling back conscription to get young people to do things. In some countries, people have to do volunteer service. People come to Canada and they make a lot of demands on the system here. And the least they can do is when it's the election day and the day to go out and put your mark on next to a candidate, go out and do your civic responsibility. And frankly, if you don't want to vote, if you say they're all losers, I don't want to vote for any of them, I'm very cynical, no problem. Go spoil your ballot. Show up. That's the big part of the problem. And I think it would make a big difference. I think it would make people focus a little more if they actually had to go and mark the ballot and say, yeah, that's my responsibility. I should look at who are these candidates.
Well, I
And
do. I agree with that. And I think one of the challenges that we have with low turnout, and without having compulsory voting, is that too much of electioneering, and you've been part of the political process, so that you know this, but too much of electioneering is identifying your vote and getting it out, rather than what I think it should be, which is about persuasion. So, all these people go out and canvass, and when they talk about canvassing, maybe they try to do some pitching of their candidate, but a lot of the sort of the training of the canvases is don't get into a long discussion, don't spend too long at the door, get on to the next door, and all you want to do is ask them, are they going to vote Liberal, Conservative, or NDP? Write it down and then move to the next door. And the only reason why they do that is so that the day before the day of the election, they can drop a pamphlet on your door to remind you to vote. And if you're voting for one of the other parties that's not the party that came and knocked, they're not going to try to tell you that there's a vote. They're going to do everything to make sure that you're unaware that it's voting day. And then on the day of the vote, they're going to knock on your door and say, did you go out and vote yet? Did you go out and vote yet? And then they're going to go back to the polling booth and they're going to check to see if you voted. And if you haven't voted, they're going to come and call or talk and knock on your door again. So it's identify the vote and get it out, which I think is a complete waste of time, when what a campaign should be about is meeting people and talking about who you are, talking about your policies, and trying to persuade people to actually vote for you. If you had compulsory voting, the whole get out the vote, identify and get out the vote would be gone, because you knew they'd be there. So you'd have to spend your time talking about who you are and what you stand for. And also connected to that is that we try to discourage people from voting, so that the negative stuff, the appealing to the base and all that kind of stuff, is we know there's going to be low turnout. So we just want our people to go and get to the ballot box. And we don't want the other people to get to the ballot box and vote. If you knew everyone was going to go, I think you'd be more positive, because you'd have to persuade rather than trying to upset people and get them to not show up. And I agree with you. We make people get driver's license. We make people, pay property taxes. We make people pay income taxes. We've got a lot of things that our society demands of us every year. Why don't we have either a small penalty or a small incentive? Either way, give people $100 or fine them $100. But make everyone somehow go to the ballot box and either vote or vote for none of the above.
Well, it's interesting that we have a government, just for example, at the federal level right now, that is super obsessed about what I call cause and effect. They have this wacky idea about their carbon tax, as one example, that they ideologically believe they need to impose this carbon tax on people across the country. And it's affecting everybody. It's affecting people in cities, especially that rely on cars and gas to move around and get around and do things, that aren't in high density urban centers, because they ideologically believe in the cause and effect of this. Apparently this government apparently at one point believed in proportional representation until they got in power, and they didn't. Because we have the first past the post system, which benefits the party in power. My point is this: what you're talking about is exactly that, cause and effect. And we should be really applying this rule at the ballot box. The cause and effect of what you've just said would be monumental in terms of making changes in this country, in not only voting and voting patterns, and I believe in the people that we elect, because in cities across this country, including Mississauga, But in Ottawa, Calgary, and Edmonton, and Halifax, and Montreal, Red Deer, St. John's, or Goose Bay, wherever, we've had in our lifetime what I call the 4-decade or 5-decade effect, the cumulative effect of bad local government that has resulted in the hollowing out of our cities, that has resulted in cities today, beautiful cities, Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, Mississauga, where we have a fentanyl crisis, we have tent parks, we have people living in parks, people getting free needles and discarded needles and urinating in shop windows and urinating on public transit and all of these things that have led to a decline in the life in municipalities and the polarization of people. And these all stem from policies that emulate from municipal governments who make decisions. A lot of these decisions are perverted decisions that are ideologically based, that are not based on just, what's good for families and neighborhoods and people and transit. There's a whole hodgepodge of things that go into this. It's this Kafkaesque experiment that have happened in cities that have destroyed the core of our cities and hollowed them out. And we say things are acceptable that frankly just are not. We've seen this in Ottawa, just as an example. We have a new mayor in Ottawa. He's been in for about 18 months. Competent guy. This mayor was elected to get to, Jim Watson decided not to run. At one point, Jim Watson was the most popular mayor in the country until he wasn't. And that was because they just completely blew, as you know, from your time as the CEO of the Ottawa Senators in some of your other business dealings. They blew the transit system here. They brought in the municipal government brought in it's like a multi-billion-dollar, $4 billion O train. We call it the no train, okay? All public money. And the people, the elected officials, they so screwed this up. They brought in a transit train in Ottawa that had never been tested in the winter. We're the coldest capital, second coldest in the world after Mongolia. They brought in a transit system here.
Colder than Moscow, really?
That had never been, yeah. And it had never been tested in any winter city. Then, oh, surprise, it opens. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And this is all municipal politics. And the people who got into it, the people making these decisions, they didn't have any experience in business. I mean, the one thing you'd bring to the table for sure, among so many things, is your business experience. And you know what debt is, and you know how to when to spend money, when you shouldn't be spending money, what a surplus is, when you put in a tax, and then when you don't, and but some people come into government, into these offices. They have no experience at all in business. They don't think debt is a thing at all. And then their entire focus is on some of these social justice issues. And I'm not saying there's not a place for that, but it's not lost on me, in our province, if someone has a mental health issue, they can be removed and put in, like in Ottawa, for example, if someone's showing mental health issues and they seem to be dangerous to themselves or others, they can be removed from the society temporarily and put in the Royal Ottawa to get treatment. And that's an appropriate thing to do to protect them from harming themselves and protect others. That's happened for decades. But our public policy with regards to drugs and people who most people on the street have mental health or drug dependency issues. And our response to that has not been to remove these people who, let's be really honest, who are troubled people. That's why they are on sidewalks, urinating and defecating on sidewalks and breaking into stores and sticking syringes in their arms and running up to people in the streets and scaring them and going up to their cars because they're not healthy people. And there's nothing wrong with saying that. It doesn't mean you're not a nice person for saying that. It's that these people need help. So what's the help we've given them? Oh, let's give them free drugs. Let's give them methadone. Let's give them a needle exchange program. Let's let them live in a tent across the street from a community of families and defecate and urinate in the park around the tents they're building. And then let's not be critical about it, because you can't be critical because there are neighbors. Really, there are neighbors. Neighbors don't rob you. Neighbors don't frighten your children. Neighbors don't like defecate in your yard. This is what we've done to our cities in this country. And then we talk about public transit and
No,
people, for example, in
hold it.
Toronto.
Let's take an issue at a time. So, Dan, this is interesting. I was at a conference recently, and an advocate for the homeless said, housing should be thought of as a right comparable to healthcare and education. And people too often think that we're trying to be fiscally responsible when we don't provide housing. And the federal government got out of housing back in the 1980s or something like that, in providing affordable or social housing. He said this is a fiscal mistake. And we've got to understand from a fiscal standpoint, it costs about $100,000 to house somebody if the government housed people. But it costs multiples of that. Maybe even some estimates estimate $1 million if you don't house them, because of all the things you've talked about. They have an unbelievable preponderance to use emergency wards and fill up emergency facilities at hospitals, because that's where they go when it's cold. That's where they go when it's sick. That's where they go when they need their medicine, etc. They are a disproportionate users of first responders because of all the issues that you mentioned. That you've got to have drug treatment centers and drug places where one can make use of drugs. That you've got sanitary issues. That you've got police issues. That you've got crime issues, and it goes on and on and on. And he said it is actually cheaper for society to provide housing than it is to not provide housing. What do you think of that?
I couldn't agree with you more. And what we're talking about here is what they call the continuum of care policy, right? And the continuum of care policy was something that came out well over a decade ago in Vancouver, where it was this idea that you need to help people who have issues and who have medical or mental health or drug issues, and get them off the street. And part of the continuum of care is to get them into housing. Okay. Obviously, people are better off if they're in housing. But here's where the whole thing gets perverted, because there are many chapters in the continuum of care. One of the chapters is you need to remove these people off the street. The second part of that might be harm reduction. So to get some people off the drugs they're on, it may require a placebo type drug, methadone or another type of drug, to just wean them off the drug, and then go to the next stage, which is to get some counseling, and then there's many stages in between, and then you get them into group housing. Then you have to give them some life skills to help them in their recovery, and then eventually get them into housing. That's all fantastic. That's all great. We should do that. Absolutely, we should do that. And of course, it would save money. But oh no, we've perverted all that. We skipped about 8 of the chapters, and we went with like 2 of them. One, let's give people some drugs, some free drugs to get them off for under the guise of harm reduction, which in fact it's not harm reduction. It's just exacerbating the problem and making the person worse. But they say, well, it's harm reduction. So they say, let's do the drug part and let's get them into housing. If we do those 2 things, well, you know what happens if people who are drugged out of their mind and they look like they're on the set of The Walking Dead, like zombies walking around. You know what happens if you put them into housing? Hello, they destroy the homes. They destroy the apartments. They turn them into these rat-infested, awful places. I've seen it here in Ottawa, because we're not following all the steps. And to your point, of course, it's cheaper to do it this way. But because we haven't done that, because we've taken these shortcuts, and then what's really awful about this is you get a lot of elected officials, and heaven forbid, I live in the center. I've always philosophically, as you know, considered myself a liberal. When I worked in government, I worked for the government of Jean Chrétien, and I'm a liberal. Like I often say, I didn't leave the Liberal Party left me, because they've gone so insanely socialist and to the left. So now what happens is, and it's really apparent at the municipal level, you have these ideological counselors who, some of them are just crazy. And they think, if you say anything that differs with them, their view that you need to give people free drugs, you need to let people live in tents and parks, that you're insensitive. and that you're, oh, heaven forbid, how dare you attack the homeless? Attacking anybody. I'm trying to fix a problem. And if you keep repeating the same thing, you're going to get the same result. Ironically, Brian, we haven't done what you've said. We haven't invested the money in healthcare. We haven't intervened to get people off the street and help them have a long-term solution that is more cost efficient. You know, I've said in Ottawa what we should do, and I certainly, you're much obviously on the ground in Mississauga. You know what we need? We need a 10-year plan. We need a 10-year plan, at least in this city, to get people off the streets and end homelessness. Now, we're never going to end homelessness, but you need a plan with a beginning, a middle, and an end that says, here's what we're going to do to tackle this problem. I can't believe when I go to Toronto, I just find it disgusting when I go around some of the neighborhoods and see these tent cities, and I feel awful for the people living in that condition, and I'm ashamed as a Canadian to see that in my cities. I'm ashamed. And I think we need a plan to get these people out of the parks and get them into a situation where they can live better. But it involves counseling, and it involves rules. It involves bylaws. Like, you can't just go and live in the park. You're not allowed to do that. But have we set up the other pathways for them to have alternatives? And that's the problem.
I agree. I think we need a 10-year plan. And, I had a conversation with someone that said, you know what? Rehab works. Removing yourself for a couple of months and going through rehab, whether it's, AA or some other similar process, it really does work. The problem is that, number one, you have to volunteer for it, or number two, if you commit a crime, the criminal justice system can use that as one of the things one does to reduce a sentence. And so you can be sort of incentivized or forced into it. But if you're in the middle, you haven't volunteered or you haven't been forced or incentivized into it, there's not a lot of incentive to get into rehab. And I think that getting people through that mental health crisis that you talk about, and actually dealing with people as people and solving some of their problems is critically important. And that may be removing them off the street, putting them in the rehab. And clearly we can't force that. But if there's a way
Why not?
of actually...
Why not? Why can't we force it?
Well, you can when they've committed a crime. And so maybe some of those things that you're talking about are crimes.
Well, here's the problem. And again, I'm not insensitive, but why can't we force it? We need to be able to remove people off the street who are committing crimes. And what we do is the people that are actually giving these people the drugs, for example, that are keeping them addicted, we're letting them out on bail. If you are selling drugs or you are carrying a weapon, you should be in prison. And if you're arrested with a weapon or drugs, you should not be getting bail. We need to change the laws. And if you're a person on the street and you're committing a bylaw offense, depending on the severity, we should be removing people off the street.
And I think what we
need
should
to
be doing
take
is giving them a reduction of whatever that otherwise sentence should be if they voluntarily go into rehab. And I think rehab works. And I think we've got to deal with the underlying problem. And then we've got to make sure that we've got federal government, provincial government, municipal government participation in social housing, because I do think, number one, it's the right thing to do, and number two, I think it's actually cheaper than the not do anything scenario. Anyway, we got to take a break for some messages because we are a for-profit enterprise that does need a couple of commercials to finance our business. So stay with us, everyone. We're going to be back in just 2 minutes with Dan Donovan talking about municipal politics, political leadership, what we need in this country today. Stay with us, everybody. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Dan Donovan. He is the editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine, which is, by the way, an excellent publication. And if you get a chance, you should check it out. You're online as well as being published in print. Are you not, Dan?
Yeah, ottawalife.com and on our social media. And please visit our site. We try to cover a lot of these issues. In fact, I just wrote an article this week, Brian, on housing. On the housing issue in this country and why we have such a crisis, the worst housing crisis in our history. As you know, rents are insane. Young people, it's really, one of the things I point out in this article, and you'll appreciate this coming from your financial background. Um, we're telling young couples today, I'm talking about people, let's say between the ages of 25, 35, they got a stress test they got to go through to get a mortgage, right? And the vast majority of them are not passing it, because how could they in this crappy environment, this economy that we have? So they're told they can't pass the stress test, but then they have to go out and pay, on average in Toronto, $2,200 a month for a studio apartment. It's up to $3,200 a month for a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment in Toronto. Same in Ottawa. So these very people who could easily afford a mortgage, if they can pay that in rent, why the hell can't they pay in mortgage? And then we've seen in the housing market, especially in the larger cities, some of these condo corporations, just this tsunami of control of homes and condos that they have. And then, you get into the condos and you're paying these insane rents. And then the people that own those condos, they're also putting in their condo fees into all of that. So my point of my article was, how is it that we've got this so wrong that we're not making it affordable for young couples and families to get into mortgages? Now, I'll tell you why that is. Because the other part of my article was about the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, who are responsible for coming up with some of these policies and so forth. Now, they're not very good at coming up with innovative ways to ensure that we can find opportunities for young people to get their mortgages. But I tell you what they are really good at, making sure they all get their bonuses during the worst housing crisis in our history. They've given themselves like $100 million in bonuses in the last 3 years, in executive bonuses and staff bonuses. And again, this is the problem we face in this country. We have public servants in this country are not serving the client. You know what the client is? The public. It's not them. It's not about them. It's not about them getting, none of them. Not one of those people, not one person at CMHC should get a bonus until the housing crisis is over. It's just like, hello, are you stupid? Like, you're a public servant. And we have a $1.2 trillion debt in this country. $1.2 trillion debt. We're going to pay $80 billion in interest on the debt in the next 19 months. And people wonder why people are struggling. And people in Toronto, Mississauga, Ottawa, they got to pay these high rents. Then they go to public transit. Public transit isn't working. And then when they do get on public transit, they got to see drug addicts lying and sleeping on these public transit systems, drugged out. The whole thing isn't working. And we have to get back to this idea, which is, again, another reason I'm very glad you're running, about what is public service? What is public service? It used to be people would go into government and they get into politics because, they'd run for politics because they had a career outside of politics.
Not
They'd done
anymore.
something exactly. Now it's a career. So we get all these people who are getting into it, and that's all they've ever done. So they get in and they lack perspective, and they don't understand money or the value of money. So they spend everyone else's money without a thought. So and then we get crappy outcomes, and then we wonder why we have crappy outcomes. I mean, even look at our what's happening in media.
Well, let's come back. Sorry, I apologize.
Sure.
Let's come back to housing because I think it's a really critically important topic. I think it is, a crisis. And you talk about how kids can't, young people can't afford a house today, and I think this is. I think it is a generational tragedy where we are the first generation in history that is going to leave an economic situation less attractive for our kids than our parents left for us. And every other generation in history has left their kids better off. And we are leaving our kids worse off, I think, for two, maybe three critically important reasons. Number one is the amount of debt that we're leaving them. And you've talked about that. That has got to be paid off in the future. And it is of historical excess, maybe comparable to the 1990s when we ended having to go through the whole, Canadian peso crisis and the program review that the Chrétien-Martin government reduced dramatically government spending and brought us into actual surplus, which was shocking to think today that we actually in the 90s had a surplus at one point in time. Number two is housing prices, because buying a house is one of those things that is part of the Canadian dream, and it's certainly part of the Mississauga dream. And I think for the vast majority of young people today in their 20s, 30s, and even in their early 40s, there's no dream of owning a house. Maybe they can own a 500, 600 square foot condo if they're lucky enough, but they can't own a house. And then number three is our productivity and prosperity is now 40% of what it is in the United States. And that is that we don't have economic growth. And I think a lot of that is based on government regulation gone askew. And I'll tell you that I think the biggest problem in housing today is the excessive amount of government red tape regulation, time it takes to get approvals, and the risk of getting approvals. CMHC Stats Canada did a major study just this past year. It said that Toronto, Vancouver, Victoria were the slowest municipalities in North America for getting housing approvals. It takes 3 to 4 times as long to get an approval as it does to actually build. And a lot of that is of limited benefit. Do I think that building should be reviewed and approved? Yes. You got to make sure it doesn't fall down. You got to make sure that it meets a certain standard. But to take, 5 to 7 years to approve a development is absurd, particularly with high interest rates, with risk, with high land costs. There's no way that people can finance that. And I think that basic supply and demand has been the biggest problem we've had in general, lack of affordability. We are building the same number of housing units today in Canada that we were building in the 1970s with a population that's 2.5 times the size. And so I think that's the number one problem is we've got to get government out of the way. It should still review and still should have zoning, though I do think that some of the as of right zoning rules that the federal government and other people are thinking about, it's interesting. Federal government is saying you can take a single family home and turn it into a fourplex. I think that the missing middle is an issue, and I think that that's probably good, though I think Ford is also right that a lot of people will oppose that. And I don't think it's actually going to make a huge impact because not everyone's going to want a basement apartment or a granny apartment or a fourplex in their house. Vancouver, BC is interesting. What they're doing, Dan, is they've passed a rule that you have an as of right zoning that you can build 12 stories if you're within 400 meters of a transit station. I think that's amazing. You take a look at the Bloor-Danforth subway line. At almost every subway stop, there's only 2-story buildings. Jennifer Keesmaat, who is, I think, a reasonably left-wing individual who was the former chief planner for the city of Toronto, she said it was one of the biggest mistakes Toronto's ever made was not increase the zoning along the Bloor-Danforth line, comparable to the increase in zoning along Yonge Street. And she said people get worried that it's going to change the fabric of our communities. Take a look at Yonge Street. You've got density around the transit stations, but a block or 2 blocks away,
you're back into residential neighborhoods.
So it impacts the major arterial and the area around the transit station, but it doesn't change 90% of Toronto that's still single family. And so I think that's something that we've got to do. And I love this. It's not quite as of right, but it's almost a minimum standard that if you're building near a transit zone, and they actually do it for bus line exchanges, they call it, in BC, you have to build a minimum of 12 stories. So they're demanding that increased density, which I think makes a ton of sense. And, I'd give you one other example if I could, with government trying to sort of get involved too much. A couple of years ago, in the vast majority of buildings in Toronto, there was a minimum parking standards that you had to have 2 parking lots per unit. An underground parking lot costs about $140,000 to build. And so therefore, if you had a minimum, you were effectively adding $200,000 to maybe $280,000 to the cost of every apartment, every condo that you were building. And a lot of those people didn't have 2 cars. And if they had a choice, they would have actually not had a car if they could save $280,000 off the price of their condo. Today, the city of Toronto is mandating a maximum of either 0.5 or 1 parking stall per unit. So government thinks they know best, but a couple of years ago it was you have to have 2 or more. Today it's you got to have 1 or less. Government tries to get involved in telling private enterprise what to do way too often. And I've been involved in the beer business, the entertainment business, the pharmaceutical business, the hockey business, as you know. I've never been in a business.
Media business.
I've never been in a business that's got so much regulation and red tape, other than maybe the pharmaceutical business, in my career. And every local councillor thinks that they know best and can tell you what you should build and what the market wants. Oh, they want bike racks. Oh, they want a bigger amenity space. Oh, they want, this thing and that thing. Local councillors shouldn't be able to tell developers. The market should tell developers what they should be building.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think what we're seeing here are a number of things sort of colliding. And key to that are counselors, ideologically based counselors in a lot of cities who have no market or business experience, who are agenda driven by their ideology that often involves spending large amounts of public money that they have some control over, and they're putting gates around it and trying to control how not only how the money is spent, but how other people who that affects are going to act, including people who are building homes. And this is one of the reasons why I think Pierre Poilievre is really having a big impact right now, because he calls them the gatekeepers, right? And at first, about a year and a half ago, I thought that's kind of a weird thing but I get it now. I get entirely what he's talking about. When he's, the regulatory process is suffocating home building in this country. It's just absolutely suffocating it.
Suffocating is a good word.
And they need to get out of the way. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, and we have a home in Ottawa, and we just wanted to put up like a wooden shed in their backyard. This guy was going to come in and put it up, and it was like to store the lawnmower and that kind of stuff, just in the backyard. We had to go through this process at City Hall that was insane to put up a shed in our yard. And there's all of this, if you don't do this, you're going to get fined and you're going to do this. Now I get, you've got to have bylaws and it's important in neighborhoods and so forth. But this was like just way beyond that. And I was just thinking, I can't imagine what it's like for someone who's like building a home or building a new or developers building new builds. These people need to get out of the way. And one of the things that Poilievre has talked about in his housing program, when we talk about the different levels of government, he's saying, look, the federal government, if he's the prime minister, is not going to give money to municipalities unless they can show they're getting the hell out of the way on this regulatory stuff when it comes to home building. If they can't show us they've done that, they're not getting our transfer payments. And I am actually I agree with that. I think that's fantastic, because it's a cause and effect thing, right? If you want to fix a system, you've got to be able to hit them at their pressure point. And we need homes. Now, what's the ironic thing in this country, Brian, is our federal housing minister now, the things you were just talking about is innovation in housing and home building and getting out of the way and letting developers do their thing and letting people who know the business make the decisions about what's the best way to build a home. Building homes along transit lines makes a lot of sense, right? But the guy we just named that's been the housing minister, he just has clued out. Everything he does, this Sean Fraser guy, to build homes involves more regulation. It just involves more spending, more taxpayer spending, instead of letting commercial people go out and build the homes. And this is the guy who before this was the immigration minister, who brought in 1.3 million people in Canada in a year when we don't have houses for them. We don't have homes for our own people. So it's a multi-government level problem that is part of it is a philosophical thing that we need to change with people. So a mindset change has to happen here to fix this.
So Dan, one of my real frustrations, and one of the reasons why I might actually think about doing this is that I worry that we are giving the problem to solve to the same people that were part of the creation of the problem. And you talked about
yes,
some of these federal
yes
people, but in this Mississauga election, the top 4 leading candidates in the polls are all current councillors. One has been a councillor since 2014, and she was a councillor and she was a member of parliament before that. So she's been in politics for a very, very long time. Another one has been a councillor for a long time and has gone from council to provincial politics, tried to run provincially, back to council to provincial politics, back and forth between the city government and the provincial government. Another one has been around for I think at least 2 terms. And the final one, ran for leader of the Ontario Liberal Party, came in last and ran for council, got on council, is now running for mayor. So, everyone is sort of a career politician and have been part of this group that have created this problem that we've got. And they're saying now that they might be the people to lead us out of the solution.
This is the problem we face in our country with politics. I don't think I could articulate it any better than you've just said it. We have these lifelong politicians who have created these problems, and now they're saying they're the solution to fixing them, the very problems they created. And that's why I never used to be for term limits, but in the last number of years, I don't think I still am there yet, but I just, because there are some politicians who get in who actually have good careers and who do some good things, but there are some people that just go from one thing to the other. It's like, we had a guy here in Ottawa who's a former provincial Wynne government guy, Yasser Naqvi. I mean, he was a Solicitor General, and he certainly didn't do any bang up job there. And then he lost in the election. Then he hangs his shingle out again. He doesn't even have to run for a nomination. He becomes the federal, because you could run a doorknob for the Liberals or the left in Ottawa Centre, and they would win. And so then he becomes the federal MP for Ottawa Centre. So he was a provincial MPP, lost the election to another NDP guy, becomes a federal Liberal MP without even having to do a nomination race. He's not even in his first year, and then he announces while he's a sitting MP that he's running for the leadership of the provincial Liberal Party, which of course he lost. So now he's the Liberal MP again. These people, that's what they do. They suck off the hind teeth to the public trust in government, and they're not helping us to move files forward and resolve problems.
So,
and that goes back to the earlier thing I said, Brian, about what's public service.
I've got a different point of view a little bit in that regard. I've done a lot of work in Dallas, and Dallas has a term limit. You can serve 2 terms, and then you got to do something. And frankly, one of the guys I spoke with said, this is like the big successful consulting firms that have the up or out policy, that you either got to get promoted or you got to leave, because we want room for the new people to join in and build up. But the term limit doesn't discourage you from trying something else. So you start as a city councillor, and then you go for state representative, and then you run for governor, and then maybe you run for Senate, and then maybe you run for president. But you don't get to stay in the same job for longer than 2 terms. And actually, I interviewed someone that said that, it used to be that municipal politics was the farm team that developed people so they could become better, politicians. That, now that we have the former leader of the Liberal Party, that is the mayor of Vaughan, the former leader of the NDP, that's the mayor of Hamilton. Other people said, no, this is like the professional leagues where you don't make it in the NHL and you got to go play in Europe. That's what's happened in municipal politics.
That's what's happening. That's a good analogy.
Politicians that end up having a retirement or a safety valve. But what really bothers me is that when they don't give up their current paycheck to run. And you mentioned one individual that stayed as a member of a federal parliament and ran for a provincial position. There was another a federal politician that ran for a provincial politician. There were provincial politicians that ran for that provincial spot, and there were municipal politicians that ran for the provincial spot, and none of them gave up their salary. And in this current election in Mississauga, it's interesting. One person who I disagree with ideologically, but I actually think this is smart from a principle standpoint, she actually retired. And she said, because if I win, there's going to be another by-election, and I can't stomach having 2 by-elections and forcing 2 by-elections, a mayor by-election and then a ward council by-election. So I am resigning, and the 2 elections can happen on the same day, whether I win or lose. 3 other councillors are keeping their role and their paycheck as a municipal councillor at the same time as they're running for the mayor's job. I just think that's wrong. You shouldn't be picking up your current paycheck if you're running for another job.
To your point, and I just take that to circle back to something I had said earlier in this discussion, which is, what is public service? Who are we serving? We're supposed to be serving the public, not public servants aren't supposed to be serving themselves. But this is exactly what this is. These people are serving themselves. They're sucking off the hind teat of public largesse. They're fully protecting themselves if they lose. They're not getting into the race. They're using the public to advance their own financial and monetary gain in themselves. And it's strange to me that in a time when our country has public, healthcare is under strain, our infrastructure is under strain, our energy sector is under strain, yet we have increased the federal public service by 40%. 40%. We've gone from 253,000 public servants in the last 7 years to 350,000. And these are full-time people. The services haven't improved. We've got, if you were to measure that, you're saying, well, what are we getting for all of this? And it's so the rules have become so lax that people, public officials, they're not held to account anymore. So they do this because they can get away with it.
I think
because they're not shamed.
I think we need accountability. And as you know, I previously really espoused a point of view of proportional representation, fixed terms, referendum, and recall. And I think recall, where you actually can, initiate a process where you can take someone out of their job, create accountability, I think is one of the best vehicles to demanding better performance. And it's interesting, the vast majority of recalls don't work. But even the threat of recall smartens people up.
What's happening in
big time
in Edmonton? Is it Edmonton? The mayor of I'm going to confuse this. It's Edmonton or Calgary. The mayor out there. Yes, the mayor. As they got 70,000 signatures, and apparently you need 500,000.
Crazy.
And that's insane. How do you get 500,000? Going back to your first point,
you needed more signatures for a recall than the person actually got in the election.
So, but it's interesting too, Brian.
When you think about the first past the post system, and you can't have proportional representation in municipal politics because you don't have parties, but when you think about the first past the post system, if you take a look at the last couple of by-elections, the turnout's been in the 20% range, and you've got 20 people running, and so therefore the person who wins can get 25%. And so therefore, call it 25% of the vote of a 25% of the elector can end up electing the mayor of the city.
Crazy.
Is that democracy?
And that's why we get bad outcomes.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with some concluding comments with Dan Donovan, the editor and publisher of Ottawa Life, talking about leadership and politics, and particularly municipal politics, in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's my pleasure to be chatting tonight with Dan Donovan. He was kind enough to reach out after I made a April Fool's announcement that I was going to be running for mayor, and said some very nice things, and encouraged me to actually seriously consider it. And so I thought it would be helpful. Dan has got a big history in politics, and he's done it active in politics as an activist, as a staffer, worked in the Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin time period in Ottawa, and he's also been a journalist as the editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine. So he covers politics extremely closely, and in Ottawa. So federal, provincial, and municipal has got a big issue, and so I thought it'd be helpful to reach out to him and talk about municipal politics and politics in general and leadership in general as to what it takes to be successful. I think we got two issues, Dan, that we got to cover in the next couple of minutes that we talked about. You talked about transit and some of the debacles in transit in Ottawa. Transit is a big issue in Mississauga. All day two-way GO train traffic, which has been talked about for 20 years on a line that goes right through Mississauga, and has not happened as of yet. is a big issue, and building an LRT along here in Ontario, which, gosh, I hope we don't have the problems of the Eglinton Crosstown or of what's happened with your LRT in Ottawa. I sat down with a very smart person who has worked for Metrolinx on a consulting base recently. Metrolinx is the regional transit authority in the Greater Toronto Area. And she said what a lot of people have previously said, which is, Brian, the problem is our procurement system. Because we have this system built in municipally and provincially and probably federally in our governments, where we got to take the lowest bid. And we got to separate them out into different contracts. You've got civil servants that don't have the expertise overseeing the integration between several different contracts, and they're always picking the lowest bid because they've got to politically. And we end up having to have litigation and consultants that try to bring it together. And she said on the Eglinton Crosstown, we had electrical wires that didn't connect and stations that didn't connect to the tracks and politicians that got involved in building stations that were too expensive for what was built below. And she said it was all about the procurement system. And if you had trusted one company and had done a design build, you'd be far better off. But our procurement system is completely broken. And she used ArriveCAN as an example, where similarly the procurement system was the problem. What do you think? What's the problem with us being able to build transit systems on time and on budget?
Well, again, I go back to the problem that we have with our municipal governments and the people that are making these decisions and the elected officials, often who have no experience, and they have allowed process. To them, process has become more important than outcomes. And they have suffocated the system and killed the system and caused inefficiencies. And that all backfires, and taxpayers end up paying for it. And taxpayers end up paying to not take the train because they didn't build the damn thing because the process was so warped that it's broken. And I think what needs to happen is the process needs an enema. And they need to come in clean. Like, for example, and again, I'm just looking at it from bird's eye view.
Quote you on that? That's a great line. The process needs enema. Oh my God.
If you look at what happened in Ottawa with the LRT, it's just such a disgrace what's happened here. The waste, the corruption, the fraud in the process, all on the what's the process all about? Oh, so we could be transparent. It's the biggest load of crap I've ever heard. The fact is, it caused more corruption. And what you need is a design build, and what the way around it, the way to effectively deal with it, I think, is to have leaders come in and say, listen, we're going to go back to some first principles here. We're not getting into all of this, process stuff under the guise of transparency so everyone can get their pound of flesh. We need to move millions of people several times a day down Lake Ontario, down the tracks, down to Toronto and around the neighborhoods. So we're going to do a design build thing. And you go back to, I call it the Frank Stronach principle: best product, best price. And you get and you be very public about it. We're gonna call on the best business people in transit to come together and to give us a plan, and that's the plan we're going to go with. And you make that transparent. I always find it funny, like in Ottawa, for example, there was so much corruption in the O-Train stuff that they had the Ford government called an inquiry, and when people wanted to have access to the documents and to the contracts, well, you can't because of third party protection, and we can't do this, and but who made all these rules? The very bureaucrats that are breaking them. So the whole system is fudged. There's an element of corruption. In fact, the guy that was running, the city official that was running and botched the whole O-Train, he left. After this commission came out and had found so much blame for the way that he had managed this, and guess where he's working now? He's now been hired by the company who screwed up the whole project that we're still saddled with. He now works for them, making a six-figure salary. So the whole thing is insane. But in Mississauga, if you need the train, it's a very simple thing, right? There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. This isn't rocket scientists. They've built these all over the world. I was at a thing last night with the ambassador of Prague. They were showing, Prague and in Czechia, and they have the most efficient transit system in Europe. And he's going like, our system worked well and we got it built, and what's going on with you guys? And Toronto, once the greatest city in Canada, has capacity and expertise to do these things. So unleash the talent and innovative people in Toronto to do this.
And I do think that the existing rail network is a huge opportunity. We've used that and exploited that with the Lakeshore line on the GO Train system. The Milton Mississauga line has, based on the big move study that was done a decade ago, an 8-to-1 benefit to cost ratio if it was all day two-way frequent GO Train service.
So why don't they do that? Why don't they do that?
They've been talking about it for 20 years. And the consultants
That's
say
insane.
A lot of transit systems have a 3-to-1 or a 2-to-1 benefit to cost ratio or a 1-to-1, and they still get built for political reasons. This one's got an 8-to-1 and hasn't been built as of yet. And you may know that when I was working in Ottawa with the Ottawa Senators, we were thinking about moving downtown, and we had contacts with an organization called Moose, which had a proposal to build a GO Train system for Ottawa that was using existing railway tracks, and it was brilliant. And there were some stupid things that were done. I remember that. The Prince of Wales Bridge, which goes from Le Breton Flats right across to Quebec, was blocked by the building of an LRT station. The tracks go from that area all the way out to Bell's Corners, which was called Bell's Corners because it was the cross of railway tracks back. And yet what Ottawa ended up doing is building an LRT on another route. Similarly, the tracks at one point in time went from right downtown.
That's right.
Out to the Via Rail station and then beyond, and was moved from right downtown to the Via Rail station. And now they're retaking that land that was taken from railway, made to a street, now putting it back as an LRT. And they could have kept the train going right downtown, which is where you want the stations to go. And I could go on. We've got existing rail lines that are being used, but could be used far more efficiently and effectively in Mississauga and in Toronto, if we only had the political courage to get things done. One more issue I got to ask before we go is, in Mississauga, for the last 2 years, we've been talking about the separation of regional government into separate cities. And it has some political appeal. Brexit had appeal. Quebec separation had appeal. Detroit, they separated from the inner city into the outer cities. And then, the economic analyses were finally done and said, actually, this will cost like $1.5 billion to taxpayers, the separation into cities. And other people have talked about amalgamation as being a better solution, and that if Mississauga and Brampton amalgamated, you'd have a city of 1.5 million people. It'd be the third largest city in Canada. And amalgamation was done in Hamilton with Hamilton, Ancaster, Stony Creek merging together. Was done in Ottawa with Ottawa, Gloucester, Canada, Orleans.
Ottawa, Nepean, Vanier, Gloucester, they all amalgamated in the 90s. Yeah.
Is it better to separate into different pieces, or is it better to amalgamate?
It's funny you ask that, because I've actually changed my views on this over the years. I thought at first it was a good idea. For example, in Ottawa, when we did the amalgamation, 25 years later, I'm not so sure. I think there are benefits to it, but I think that for the rural areas here, it has not worked very well. They have not gotten the type of attention and fairness that the people in the sort of more populated areas get. And I don't know that bigger is necessarily better. To me, I'm sorry, actually, I didn't know Mississauga was thinking there was a discussion to amalgamate with Brampton, because to me, I just think if I was from Mississauga, I would not want that, because Mississauga has a very strong brand right now. I think it's got a pretty good a pretty good reputation. Like when people say Mississauga, you don't think negative things about it. It's got challenges like other cities, but I don't see the benefit of. I don't know how that benefits people in Mississauga to pool together with Brampton. That's Patrick Brown is the mayor of Brampton, right?
Yes,
I think. Yeah, I just think it's all about services.
Just challenge that for a second, and I'm not saying it's the right thing. But what this economic analysis showed was Peel Police was far more efficient than having two different police forces, one for Mississauga and one for Brampton. And that by extension, if you had one fire department, because today there's two separate fire departments, you would have the same sort of level of efficiency. That the hospitals have merged, the United Ways have merged, the Regional Board of Trades have merged. Not necessarily all the times with Brampton, some of the times with frankly Toronto. That transit, sewage, planning, a lot of those things are combined. And yet we end up having to duplicate it, if not frankly triplicate it, because it's got to happen in Mississauga, Brampton, and then the region appeal. And so in business, you would have probably merged and you would have looked for those efficiencies. I sat down with Hazel McCallion, the former mayor of Mississauga, at one point in time, and she said, it was interesting relative to your comment about urban. She said that the 1996 GTA task force that recommended the amalgamation of Mississauga and Brampton or all of Peel into one city was the right thing, she said, but no one's got the political courage to do it. And she said the one thing is Caledon, which is a rural area to the north, probably should join the region north of it rather than joining into the city. And that GTA task force suggested amalgamation of Peel into one, Halton, which is Oakville and Burlington and Milton, into another, York, which is Markham, Richmond Hill, Vaughan, et cetera, into another, and Durham, which is Ajax, Pickering, and Oshawa, into a fourth, and that those four cities plus the city of Toronto, now amalgamated, should reformulate into a GTA council comparable to the Metro Council of old. But she said that's the kind of smart governance that's too radical, that no politicians got the political courage to actually suggest it or make it happen.
It's well, I agree with one thing on that. The key has to be smart governance and avoiding duplication of services that serve taxpayers best. But that's a tough call. I think the jury's still out in Ottawa on amalgamation, but I think overall it worked. I just think that it didn't work well for the rural areas. That's what I would say. But a lot of what you're saying is making a lot of sense to me. I'm actually going to go and do some more reflection on that, because that is a very interesting issue that I really should revisit. But it's about, to your point, it's about efficiency for services and taxpayers and money. That's what drives these things.
Dan Donovan, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. You've raised a lot of interesting issues.
I'm going to be following you. I really hope you do it. You'd be a fantastic public service. Thank you so much for having me on your show today.
Dan Donovan, editor and publisher of Ottawa Magazine. I really appreciate your comments and your thoughts and your knowledge of what's going on municipally, provincially, and federally in Canada. Really appreciate it. That's our show for tonight, everybody. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Ottawa, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.